So think of an auditor as like a home inspector.
Right, yeah, that's a pretty good way to look at it.
Yeah, so, you're buying a house, you hire a professional, and they hand you this nice formal report saying the property is perfectly safe. So obviously you move in.
Naturally.
But then, the very next day, the roof literally collapses. The basement floods, and the entire foundation just splits in half.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Right, and when you call the inspector, just furious, they very calmly point out that, well, their contract only required them to check if the walls were painted, not if the foundation was actually sinking.
It's the classic, not my job defense.
Exactly. And today, we've got this massive stack of evidence to get into. We're talking a leaked 7,000-page forensic report, independent financial analyses, and some really hard-hitting investigative journalism from Amungain and Open Secrets.
Yeah, it's a very heavy stack of sources for this deep dive.
It is. And all of it points to one terrifying question about the whole global financial system, really. Like, what actually happens when the people we literally pay to check the foundation are incentivized to just ignore the cracks?
Right. And what we are looking at today is the systemic failure of the big four auditing firms in South Africa. Specifically, we're going to focus heavily on Deloitte's role.
Right.
We're looking at their role in the catastrophic collapses of Steinhoff and Tongaat Hulett, and also these highly irregular consulting contracts they had at Eskom.
Which is just a wild story on its own.
Absolutely. But the core of this whole issue is a structural clash. See, the auditing industry relies heavily on this concept they call the expectations gap. That's their main defense.
The expectations gap.
Yeah. They argue that the public simply expects way too much of them, that they aren't hired to be fraud hunters.
Okay.
But the legal and professional standard, they are actually bound by mandates professional skepticism.
Which means what exactly?
It basically means having a questioning mind. You can't just take management's word for it. You have to actually dig.
Right, which makes sense. And, if you're listening right now and wondering why this matters to you, or like why we are digging into corporate accounting mechanics today, I want you to just think about your own retirement fund for a second.
Exactly. That's where it hits home.
Yeah, because this isn't just, abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. When these corporate roofs collapse, it's public money, it's pension funds, it's everyday life savings that are just getting crushed in the rubble.
It really is.
So let's look at how a sinking foundation actually gets ignored by these professionals. And the most explosive example in our research has to be Steinhoff.
Oh, Steinhoff. I mean, financial analysts basically described it as a giant Ponzi scheme.
A giant Ponzi scheme, which is insane for a company that big.
Yeah. And Deloitte audited Steinhoff for 20 years. 20 years. And over those 2 decades, Steinhoff grew into Europe's second largest furniture retailer, right? Trailing only IKEA.
Wow, only IKEA.
But the internal reality was entirely different. So there's this 7,000-page PwC forensic report, which, by the way, Steinhoff desperately tried to keep hidden for years.
Yeah, journalists literally had to force its release.
Right. And that report details how their CEO, Markus Joost, essentially engineered a 6.5 billion euro fraud over more than 10 years.
Hold on. Let me just process that number. 6.5 billion euros.
It's massive.
I mean, in fictitious or irregular transactions.
Yeah.
In South African terms, that is well over 100 billion rand.
Yeah, it's an astronomical sum.
You don't just misplace 100 billion rand behind the sofa. I mean, how does a fraud of that magnitude actually work mechanically without the auditors noticing a thing?
Well, the reports mention this concept called reverse accounting.
Reverse accounting. Okay, explain that.
So normally, right, a company conducts business. Say they sell 1,000 couches. They calculate the revenue, they subtract the costs, and whatever is left over is the profit.
Right. Just standard accounting 101.
Exactly, standard accounting. But Joost and his inner circle, they completely flipped that upside down. Joost would basically look at the market, decide what profit number he needed to show investors to keep Steinhoff's stock price soaring.
Oh, wow. So he picked the target first.
Yes. He picked the target, and then his team would literally work backwards to invent the numbers required to hit that target.
Wait, they just fabricated the revenue out of thin air.
They did, but they built a really complex architecture to make it look real.
Okay, so how did they do that?
They used this massive web of shell companies scattered all across Europe with these really vague names like the TG Group, Telgarth and Campion Group.
Sounds very official.
Right. And on paper, these entities were set up to look like completely independent third-party buying groups. But in reality, they were secretly controlled by Just's friends and former Steinhoff executives.
So it was basically an elaborate shell game. They were just shuffling debt between different arms of Steinhoff, reclassifying that debt as cash, and calling it a contribution or a rebate from these supposedly independent partners.
That's exactly what they did. They were negotiating with themselves and stamping it as legitimate revenue.
But surely an auditor asks to see the receipts for massive transactions like that?
You would think so, and that is where the deceit just becomes incredibly brazen. So take the Serta Simmons deal in 2017, for example.
Okay.
Juste needed Deloitte to sign off on accounts showing a 2.4 billion euro profit for the year. So he just decides that a third of that, about 740 million euros, was going to come from a deal with the U.S. mattress giant Serta Simmons.
Just decides it.
Yeah. He claims Serta Simmons had agreed to pay $200 million as a reimbursement for marketing, plus another 557 million euros to buy Steinhoff's brands.
But, and this is the crazy part, when the PwC forensic investigators later went and actually asked the controlling shareholder of Serta Simmons about this massive brand buyout, the shareholder had absolutely no idea what they were talking about.
None whatsoever.
The entire transaction was just a phantom. It didn't exist.
It was entirely made up. Which brings us to the airplane invoice, which is, honestly, it's arguably the most absurd detail in this entire 7,000-page document.
I was waiting for this part.
It's just a defining moment of corporate hubris. So it's November 2016. Markus Juste is sitting on an airplane. He takes a piece of paper, handwrites an invoice for 23.5 million euros, which is about 376 million rand at the time.
Handwrites it on a plane.
Handwrites it, and he hands it to his finance director to process into Steinhoff's formal accounts, claiming it was a rebate from the TG Group.
It's like a bank accepting a napkin with $1 million scribbled on it as collateral for a mortgage.
It really is.
How does a globally respected audit firm look at a handwritten 376 million rand invoice from a CEO and just check the box?
Well, PwC's head of forensics, Trevor White, he stated on the record that in 20 years of investigating financial crimes, he had never seen a situation where a group CEO handwrites a document to artificially inflate profits during the finalization of global results.
Because it's insane.
Right. And once Juste handed over that piece of paper, his accomplices were talking the company secretary, the European CFO. They just went into an absolute frenzy.
Scrambling to cover it up, I assume.
Yeah, scrambling to create backdated documents, fake email trails, anything to give the illusion of a legitimate transaction. And their explicit goal, which was actually noted in their communications, was purely to, quote, satisfy the auditors.
But Steinhoff's board, they weren't just a bunch of easily fooled amateurs, right? They had highly educated people overseeing the company.
Very highly educated.
There were literally 3 PhDs in accounting sitting on that board.
Yep, 3 of them.
So why did no one push back?
You really have to look at the psychology of corporate governance under an autocrat. The investigations paint this very vivid picture of a culture defined by deference, intimidation, and honestly, the blinding effect of massive financial rewards.
Right. Money talks.
Exactly. Juste used his charisma and just aggressive bullying to bulldoze these irregular transactions past the board. But more importantly, he pacified them with the illusion of relentless success.
Because the line on the graph was always going up.
Always. And when a stock price is climbing year after year and everyone is getting incredibly wealthy, human nature strongly disincentivizes asking difficult questions.
Oh, for sure. You don't want to be the guy who stops the gravy train.
Exactly. One former director even admitted that by the time these transactions reached the auditors and the advisors, the machinery of deceit was so well oiled that nobody noticed a thing. Everyone just assumed someone else further down the chain was verifying the underlying economic reality.
Everyone thought someone else was doing the actual checking.
Right. Up until December 2017.
Yeah. When Deloitte finally asks for hard proof of that Serta Simmons mattress deal.
And Juste obviously can't produce the phantom documents.
And the entire house of cards just implodes overnight. The stock collapsed, wiping out 230 billion rand in market value in a matter of days. Which, and this is crucial, leads us to an incredibly important structural issue.
Right.
Because Steinhoff wasn't just a one-off anomaly. If a 20-year relationship breeds that kind of catastrophic complacency, What happens when an auditor essentially becomes part of the furniture?
Well, the financial analysts at First Avenue, they call this the longevity trap.
Longevity trap.
Yeah. The data clearly shows that the longer an audit firm stays attached to a single company, the blurrier that line of independence gets. I mean, we just discussed Deloitte's 20-year tenure at Steinhoff.
Right.
Let's look at the South African sugar and property giant, Tongaat Hulett.
Okay.
Deloitte was their auditor for 82 years.
Wait, I really need to wrap my head around this. 82 years.
82 years.
So Tongaat Hulett used the exact same auditing firm from before World War II up until 2019.
That is correct.
I mean, if you employ a service provider for 8 decades, they aren't an independent watchdog anymore. They're a corporate family.
Pretty much, yeah.
You are literally attending each other's weddings at that point.
Mm.
How do you aggressively interrogate the finances of an executive team that you've known your entire career?
The short answer is you often don't. The forensic investigations into Tongaat Hulett revealed a massive overstatement of profits and assets by nearly 12 billion rand.
12 billion, wow.
Yeah, under the leadership of Peter Stoud, who had been CEO for 15 years. And they achieved this through several accounting maneuvers, but primarily by prematurely recognizing revenue from land sales and incorrectly capitalizing expenses.
Okay, let's break those mechanics down for a second so we all understand. Recognizing revenue prematurely means what? Exactly. You just sign a piece of paper saying someone might buy a sugarcane field next year and you book the cash today.
Precisely. They were recording income for land deals where the conditions hadn't even been met yet, or the sales hadn't been finalized.
Wow.
And capitalizing expenses, that's another classic manipulation.
How does that one work?
Well, instead of recording a daily operational cost that immediately reduces today's profit, so like regular maintenance or just standard farming costs,
Right.
they would classify it on the balance sheet as a long-term investment.
Huh?
So this artificially inflates the company's apparent value and makes it look flush with cash when in reality the money is just bleeding out the door.
That is so deceptive.
It really is. And just like Steinhoff, Tongaat had this culture of deference where employees blindly followed these aggressive accounting instructions without really daring to question their veracity.
And while the executives were scoring massive performance bonuses based on these totally imaginary profits, I mean, Peter Stoud took home 94 million rand just while the books were being cooked. Fallout for the public was devastating.
Completely devastating.
Tongaat lost 97% of its value. Steinhoff lost 98%. And going back to why this matters to everyday people, right?
Yeah.
948 different South African pension funds were exposed to Steinhoff.
That's a huge number.
The government employee pension fund alone lost 21 billion rand. That is the retirement savings of teachers, nurses, and civil servants just evaporating into thin air. All because the foundation wasn't checked.
Exactly. And the First Avenue report explicitly warns that this dynamic is a primary driver of massive wealth destruction.
A longevity trap.
Yes. When audit firms rely on clients for decades of continuous fees, their professional independence just naturally erodes. Unchecked corporate loyalty within the audit space directly translates to a permanent loss of capital for everyday stakeholders.
So when the roof does cave in and billions of rand are just gone, what is the auditor's defense? You mentioned the expectations gap earlier.
Right. The auditing industry leans very heavily on this concept to explain the disconnect between what the public assumes an auditor does and what auditors claim their actual legal mandate is. The industry's position is that their role is merely to express an opinion on whether the financial statements provided by management comply with international accounting standards.
Right.
They argue, look, we are not forensic investigators, and it is not our job to actively hunt for sophisticated fraud.
See, I have to push back on that logic.
Go for it.
This expectations gap defense sounds exactly like a bank security guard claiming their only job is to make sure the teller's uniform code is followed, not to actually stop the bank robbers strolling past them with duffel bags full of cash.
It's a great analogy, and it's a defense that academic researchers and financial regulators are, frankly, increasingly rejecting.
I would hope so.
The counter-argument is deeply rooted in that legal mandate of professional skepticism. Skepticism requires an auditor to have a questioning mind, to be constantly alert to conditions that might indicate possible fraud, and to critically assess the audit evidence.
So basically doing your job.
Right. It means you cannot simply take management's assertions at face value.
Right. Like if management hands you a handwritten invoice from an airplane for 376 million rand, professional skepticism dictates you don't just politely ask for a backdated receipt to make the file look pretty.
Exactly.
You interrogate whether the 376 million rand actually exists in the real world.
Which is exactly the point the academic sources in our research are making. If an auditor uncritically signs off on whatever management places in front of them, they're fundamentally failing their mandate to protect the public interest.
Yeah.
If auditors are reduced to just a highly paid rubber stamp for corporate executives, their entire social utility just vanishes.
Because the public relies on these signatures to ensure the integrity of financial markets.
Exactly. If the auditors aren't verifying the economic reality behind the numbers, the whole system is fundamentally broken.
So if a decades-long relationship can blind an auditor through complacency, what happens when that auditor is actually making more money giving the company advice than they are checking their math?
Now we get to the really messy part.
Yeah, let's pivot from corporate fraud to state capture, specifically looking at ESCOM. Because the big four firms, they don't just do auditing anymore, do they? It's almost like a side business now.
Consulting is the real profit engine. The big four make roughly 2/3 of their global income from consulting and advisory services.
2/3?
Yes, and this dual role, acting as an independent watchdog while simultaneously selling lucrative advice, it creates a profound structural conflict of interest.
I can imagine.
And we see this play out vividly at ESCOM with Deloitte's CFO transition laboratory contracts.
Okay, unpack the mechanics of this for me.
Mm-hmm.
In 2016, under ESCOM's then CFO Anuj Singh, Deloitte secured these contracts to essentially train financial officers.
Yes.
But they completely bypassed standard procurement laws, like the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act.
Yeah.
How did they actually get around the law to secure the tender?
Well, they utilized a strategy of unsolicited proposals and these off-the-record briefings before a formal tender process was even opened.
Oh.
But the most alarming detail uncovered by Open Secrets is that Deloitte actually had 42 staffers, including senior partners, working full-time at ESCOM for 5 months, quote, at risk.
Wait, working at risk, meaning they were working without a signed contract guaranteeing payment.
Exactly. No contract.
Who deploys 42 highly paid consultants for 5 months for free unless they absolutely know the game is rigged in their favor?
Right. Well, working at risk is actually a recognized mechanism that was identified during the state capture era. It operates on corporate psychology, really.
How so?
By deploying teams and doing all this work up front, the consulting firm creates a massive sunk cost and this operational reliance within the state-owned enterprise.
I see.
It virtually forces the executives to eventually award them the contract just to, legalize the work that has already been integrated into the company.
That is incredibly manipulative.
It is. And when the tender at ESCOM was finally formalized, Deloitte's proposal was up to 5 times more expensive than their competitors.
5 times.
Yeah. And ESCOM's own management later explicitly described these 207 million rand tenders as pure corruption.
Pure corruption. I mean, it really paints a picture of audit firms using the prestige and trust of their watchdog badge to just unlock the back door to highly inflated, non-competitive consulting gigs.
The evidence strongly suggests that, yes, the aggressive pursuit of massive consulting fees creates an environment where profit motives completely eclipse professional duties.
Yeah, because if your firm is generating hundreds of millions of rand in advisory fees from an executive like Anuj Singh, how objective can your auditing arm really be if it's ever called upon to scrutinize the financial decisions of those exact same executives?
It completely compromises the entire foundation of independence.
Of course it does.
Ultimately, ESCOM actually took Deloitte to court over these contracts.
Okay, and what happened?
Well, they settled out of court. Deloitte agreed to pay back 150 million rand, but while publicly maintaining there was absolutely no evidence of state capture or corruption on their part.
Unbelievable. So they pay back 150 million, they still keep 57 million, and nobody has to admit any wrongdoing.
Basically, yes.
Which brings us to the final, really glaring hole in this entire system, the illusion of accountability.
Right.
Because with billions lost in pension funds, and terms like pure corruption being thrown around in court filings before these quiet settlements are reached, where's the reckoning? Like, who actually regulates the regulators?
Well, in South Africa, that responsibility falls to the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors.
IORBA. Okay.
But our sources highlight some severe, almost debilitating structural weaknesses within the regulator itself. For one thing, the maximum fine IRBA can levy against an auditing firm for a transgression is a paltry 250,000 rand.
Wait, 250,000 rand?
Yeah.
For a big four firm pulling in billions of rand in revenue annually, that's not a deterrent, that's a rounding error. That's like the catering budget for a Tuesday morning strategy meeting.
Exactly. It is entirely insufficient to enforce compliance. But the structural failure becomes even more apparent when you look at the conflicts of interest at the highest
Oh,
levels.
boy.
So in April 2020, IRBA appointed Janitha John as its new CEO.
Okay.
The glaring issue with this appointment: Janitha John was the non-executive director who headed Tongaat Hulett's audit committee for 9 years leading up to May 2019.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm hearing this correctly.
It's a lot, I know.
The head of the audit committee for Tongaat Hulett during the exact 9-year period, they were fictionalizing 12 billion rand in accounts and prematurely recognizing land sales. She becomes the head of the national regulatory body that is supposed to investigate the auditors of that very company.
That is correct.
You literally cannot write a better script for regulatory capture.
You really can't. It perfectly illustrates this deeply problematic revolving door between corporate boardrooms, the major auditing firms, and the regulatory bodies meant to police them.
It's all the same people.
Right. And the academic papers we reviewed emphasize that when the people setting the standards and enforcing the rules are the exact same individuals who sat on the boards during these historic financial failures, genuine accountability is impossible. The system is essentially just policing itself.
Wow. And, I mean, what is Deloitte's official stance on all of this? Like, after Steinhoff, Tongaat, Eskom,
What do they actually say about their role?
well, in their 2019 transparency report, Deloitte stated they were embarking on a, quote, journey of self-reflection.
A journey of self-reflection.
Yes. However, they also firmly stated that their extensive internal investigations found absolutely no evidence of any unethical behavior, corruption, or state capture on the part of the firm or its partners.
A journey of self-reflection where you look in the mirror and decide you did absolutely nothing wrong.
Basically.
I mean, as long as the financial penalties remain a fraction of the consulting fees, self-correction is just a complete illusion. It's just the cost of doing business. And the consensus across the independent financial analyses and the academic reports is very clear. The global market requires a fundamental structural redesign of auditor liability.
Something has to change.
The monopoly of the Big Four needs to be challenged. And the legal liability for failing to exercise professional skepticism, it needs to carry real existential weight for these firms.
Yeah. Because if the penalties don't threaten the survival of the firm, the cycle of impunity will just inevitably continue.
Precisely.
All right, let's bring this all together. We started with the sheer audacity of Marcus Joost writing a 376 million rand fake invoice on an airplane, right? And a system so blinded by uninterrupted profit growth that it actually passed muster.
Yeah.
Then we broke down how Tongaat Hulett exploited an 82-year relationship with its auditor to artificially inflate assets by 12 billion rand, completely devastating the pensions of everyday civil servants.
The longevity trap in action.
Exactly. Then we examine how Eskom's bloated consulting contracts utilize that at-risk strategy to bypass procurement laws, showing how the hunt for advisory fees just totally eclipses the duty of care.
Right.
And finally, we saw how regulators, armed with these tiny fines and massive conflicts of interest, offer the public nothing more than an illusion of accountability.
It really represents a profound failure of the compliance ecosystem. The gatekeepers who are structurally mandated to protect the public interest have, in many of these instances, basically become facilitators of the very risks they are meant to mitigate.
Which leaves you, our listener, with a final lingering question to explore on your own.
Yeah.
If the Big Four auditing firms are considered too big to fail because the entire global financial system relies on their stamp of approval, yet we've just seen how easily that stamp can be compromised by complacency and consulting fees, does the modern capitalist system actually run on hard numbers, or just an illusion of trust?
That is a very sobering thought to end on. Thank you for joining us as we mapped out the architecture of this systemic failure.
Yeah, but thanks for coming on this deep dive into the source material with us. Next time you see a home inspector signing off on a pristine foundation, maybe go check the basement yourself. Catch you next time.